Robert Boutillier. Welcome to my video series on the social license. In this series, I approach a social license as a management framework for getting social acceptance for an operation and for managing social political risk. This introduction to the social license is in two parts. The first part introduced some basic concepts like stakeholders, the legal license, social political risk, policy narratives, and narrative contests. Here in the second part, we look at the latest model of the social license and how it can be applied to develop social political risk management strategies. Here's my latest model of the social license. It takes into account the impacts of policy and the media. The left side shows networks of narratives and stakeholders interacting in a repetitive socio-political churn to produce a given level of social license. And on the right side of the graph, the level of social license determines whether the organization will face higher or lower legal and extra-legal barriers to its activity. Now let's take a look at it piece by piece. In the leftmost column, the social political churn consists of the mutual influences flowing between the network of stakeholders and the network of narratives and their elements. The stakeholder network can be made visible by interviewing stakeholders and collecting information on their relationships with other stakeholders. This is what is done in a typical Stakeholder 360 study. The narratives network can be made visible by using artificial intelligence to analyze texts from stakeholders, which can come from interviews, their websites, their social media posts, and their publications. The second column is essentially the analysis of the data from the first column to determine which coalitions are promoting which narratives and how influential each coalition and narrative is. The third column is a social license, which you can calculate from the analyses in the second column. For strategic purposes, it's best to calculate it at the level of individual stakeholders and keep track of which coalitions they belong to. The fourth column is all the actions that stakeholders might take based on the level of social license they grant. These include changes to legal and regulatory requirements, financial or economic decisions, and direct obstacles or impediments that stakeholders might choose to place upon the company's access to vital resources. Finally, in the rightmost column, there are the impacts of these actions on the focal organization's capacity to conduct the activity in question. Some of you might be familiar with the Thompson and Boutillier model of the social license that postulates 4 levels of social license. That idea is subsumed in the third column. The social political churn might lead a given stakeholder to grant a social license at any one of these levels. The crucial perceptions that determine the dividing lines between the levels are the stakeholders' perceptions of the focal organization's legitimacy, credibility, and trustworthiness. Let's look at that social political churn in more detail using this hypothetical case of a mining company. Rural stakeholders, represented by the square nodes on the bottom left, grant a relatively high social license because the company helped make water available. The collaboration to make that happen developed trust. The circular nodes at the top left represent the ideas in this narrative about working together to secure the water supply. Their colors represent the average level of social license embedded in the narrative as assessed by a sentiment analysis of the text. Communities a little further from the mine are getting neither enough rain nor enough jobs at the mine. They express a narrative that blames the company for unfair hiring practices because it gives priority to applicants from the closest villages. The urban stakeholders are mostly concerned about climate change and see the mining company as being net neutral on that issue. They grant a mixed social license based on a mixture of the reputation of the company and the reputation of the industry. Notice that the blue, green, and orange ovals represent clusters of concerns that make up 3 distinct but related narratives. They are A, the local water supply story, B, the story about access to jobs at the mine, and C, the climate change story. The 3 narratives have some links among them because rural livelihoods depend on water and are affected by climate change. This illustrates two of the network features of narratives. First, narrative elements are networked into stories, and second, stories are linked to each other in what some political scientists call meta-narratives. Managing social political risk using the social license concept works best with a combination of three types of data. One is the level of social license itself. That, of course, tells you who the supporters and opponents are. There are quantitative measures for the social license, and I have an international database to compare the scores to. The second data type is the pattern of collaborative network ties. The third type is the network configuration of narrative elements. The latter two determine the first. That is, the churn that occurs between the stakeholder relations networks and the narrative networks determines the level of social license. With my colleague Dr. Kyle Barr, I've also developed an artificial intelligence program that automates the work of picking out narrative elements from texts, and that can be used to continuously assess the level of social license from ongoing streams of texts, like tweets, blogs, radio and TV broadcasts, and any other source that can be represented as text. It's called the Social License and Controversy Detector and Analyzer, or SLACTA. Going from the analysis of these three types of data to social license strategies often involves two basic approaches. One, you can collaborate with stakeholders on solving the problems they have identified. Sometimes this means changing how you perform the activity in question or developing initiatives that produce more desirable outcomes of the activity. An example for a mining operation would be to supplement its local hiring and contracting with an entire regional economic development program supported by multiple stakeholders, sponsors, and sectors. Two, you can change the story about the company or the activity. Sometimes the problem cannot be solved until it is contextualized in a more encompassing narrative that clears the way for innovative solutions. In a highly polarized situation, responding to a narrative based on unfounded fears can seem daunting, or even hopeless, until you have the social network information to show you where the leverage points are. Here's the 2009 stakeholder network of Minera San Cristobal, which is a mine in Bolivia. This is also in my latest book with co-author Ian Thompson, entitled The Social License, The Story of the San Cristobal Mine. The colors of the nodes show the level of social license granted by each stakeholder organization. The nodes towards the top are the more influential stakeholder organizations. The office of the president of the municipality is the most influential stakeholder. The lines show whether or not there's a collaborative relationship between pairs of stakeholders. Note that most of the support is on the left, where the nearest villages are located. The mine workers live in these villages, but even in these villages, there are stakeholders opposed to the mine. On the right side, there's a group of agriculture-oriented traditional organizations. They opposed the mine and were comparatively interconnected with one another, meaning they had the capacity to take political action. The narrative information collected in interviews with them showed that they were offended by the fact that the mining villages were becoming prosperous while everyone else was being left behind. Moreover, they had strong ties to the national president, Evo Morales, and were pushing for nationalization of the mine. The dashed semicircle indicates that they had little contact with the mining villages or with anyone who had a positive opinion of the project. The narrative information from the mining villages showed that they too wanted prosperity more equally spread across the region, although they defended their own monopoly on the mining jobs. The most influential stakeholder wanted the same thing too because it would increase municipal revenues. Therefore, the recommended strategy was an inclusive regional economic development initiative. In 2011, a repeat of the Stakeholder 360 study showed a drastic change. Those dark green stakeholders at the top right here were the strongest supporters in 2011. They were the same ones who were the strongest opponents in 2009. Their influence helped raise the overall social license level. They had been converted to supporters by an initiative to foster regional economic development. The sudden world demand for quinoa, a traditional crop in the area, helped propel the agricultural sector. The Regional Development Initiative also increased the number of collaborative ties among the mining villages and other organizations, which reduced the social political risk. The municipal president moved from the top influence position in 2009 to the middle area. This was a result of ties based on voluntary collaboration becoming more plentiful and stronger among the villages and other organizations. In 2009, most stakeholders were isolated except for their formal ties mandated by government. In 2011, the growth of voluntary collaborative ties crowded out the dominance of legalistic ties. In other words, the region experienced a growth in social capital, which research shows is one of the strongest predictors of rising prosperity. There was an occupation of the mine that occurred while these interviews were being conducted in 2011, but it was not associated with the withdrawal of the social license. Instead, it brought to the forefront the desire for improved equality and access to health care. That led to a collaborative initiative to obtain a regional hospital. The construction of the hospital was completed in 2018. In subsequent years, we expanded the geographic range of the stakeholders to include national politicians and news media. That revealed an anti-business, anti-foreigner bias in the narrative about the mine. Strategies were then developed to counteract this prejudice. Well, that's your basic introduction to the social license as a risk management framework. Be sure to have a look at my other videos that deal with other interesting aspects of the social license.